probably going to be here when he's here in any case.
Okay.
So let's pray, and then we'll do our thing. God of grace, we're thankful for the time we get to gather tonight, even just a small group of us, to think about your word, to think about how we could effectively preach and teach this, to think about how we can put this together over the summer. I pray this will be a valuable time for us, a valuable time for those who can watch later on, and that we can put together a series that is that honors you, that is constructive for your people, and that is a point of entry and contact for them to worship you and to know you and to deepen their relationship with you. So we pray these things in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Okay.
Could I
do what you got to do.
Advertisement here first?
Yeah.
And just say, down here so I'm on camera. Just by way of introduction to what we're doing, and to those who are watching from home, this will be our third installment of the Campfire Stories series, and probably the final installment in our summer sort of sequences. And the suggested outline of what when is done in sequential order. The one place where we could switch things up if people really wanted to do so, I put all of the Solomon sermons or messages set for camp. Partly thinking that then we can do Saul and David as a church family and treat camp as a bit of an anomaly because not everybody will be there. Mm-hmm. So I still think that's probably the best plan. For those that go to camp, they'll come back and have 3 more weeks of David, kind of out of sequence. But anyone who has opinions on that would be welcome. And then maybe at the end of the lecture, I would just ask if you thought you were inspired to sign up, that you would give me even a tentative, I'd be interested in this date or this topic, and that will help me plan, since we're only a month away from the the first lecture, or the first sermon rather. So enough of that. Thank you, Colin.
Cool. And yeah, we'll cover to some degree or another basically all the passages that are in that that are in the summer series today, at least broadly speaking. Do we have the screen on there too? Is that
I can do that? Yeah.
Okay, cool. And the screen probably matters more than I do. I'm just going to sit here and talk. Anyway, we can be really informal because there's only a few of us, and there's even only a couple people joining us after the fact, watching the video. And so we can be pretty informal if we want to stop and talk and ask questions about things, or if you're like, hey, wait, I don't understand. Please talk about that more. We can do that. That's fine. I have kind of 3 central takeaways that I'm going to work us towards, at least in my mind. There will be lots more than just 3 things we talk about, but 3 main ideas. The first is I want to introduce us to a way of thinking about Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, particularly those 4 books. The way that biblical scholars tend to think about them, we think about them actually as being one unit in the Old Testament: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Not 4. They are 4 books, but they're 4 books that form one history, and we call this history the Deuteronomistic History. Named after the book of Deuteronomy, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is as we go forward with the conversation tonight. So the first thing is to talk about, to sort of understand what the Deuteronomistic history is and how that perspective impacts the way that we would interpret the books that we're talking about. And especially, we're really going to be in Samuel and Kings in this series, right? Like this is like David and Solomon, which is that story is basically all in Samuel and Kings, and we can talk a little bit about Chronicles if we want to. But we'll talk about Deuteronomistic history. That's the first thing. Second thing is, there is a habitual way people approach David especially, but also Solomon, that I want to caution us against a little bit, and I want to put some caveats around. So I kind of want to avoid like what I might call heroic figure preaching, or heroes of faith preaching, or something like that, or morality tale preaching. These are ways that people sometimes approach David's stories especially. The people we're talking about in these stories, David, Solomon, and all the various other characters, right? Jonathan, Saul, and Samuel, and so on, and so on, and so on. All these characters, they are very complicated people, and none of them are really meant to be emulated as such, or at least not in every case or at all times. They are small-scale and large-scale examples of Israel's relationship with God, and all of its sort of complexity and messiness. They're very, very human, and so we want to understand them in the context that they're in, right? So we don't want to make this a everybody should be like David all the time series, because everybody definitely should not be like David all the time, because David is terrible a substantial portion of the time, which is what the story is sometimes about. So we want to approach this with some complexity, right? Now, the flip side of that, instead of trying to do like let's tell a bunch of hero stories, instead what should we do? And this is the third thing I really want to get us towards, is to consider these stories in the light of the full canon of Scripture, of all of Scripture and its revelation, and to consider these stories in light of Christ especially. So given what we know about God through Jesus Christ, what can we learn about these stories of ancient Israel? And the stories of successes and failures, and where the relationship is going well and the relationship is going poorly. What can these things teach us in that sort of broader scope? So that's kind of I'm going to take maybe a more covenantal perspective on these stories as a way to frame how to approach each of the particular stories. Is that making some sense so far? So those are the three big goals that I have. And of course we're going to talk about lots of bits and pieces of the stories, the Samuel King story. Before we get to that, let's start here. Well, we're not. This isn't really before. This is that first bit. Let's talk about the idea of Deuteronomistic history. But let's talk about history writing to start with, and what we call historiography. So historiography is the study of history writing, or the philosophy of history writing. And so when we want to talk about what kind of history writing is a certain book, that's an historiographical question. So let me start it this way. If I had a book, or if I gave you a book, and this book has no cover page, and the author page has been ripped out, and the page at the front that has like the date and all that information, it's all been ripped out, and all that's left is the actual content of the story. And you read it, and you're like, this is a history of World War II, right? You know a little bit about World War II, you've never read this whole book, you're like, everything in the book happens in the time and place of World War II. Let's say it's all even in the European theater in World War II. And then if I asked you, when was that book written? When was that book written? What's the answer to that question?
After World War II.
After World War II. Yeah. So the answer, so Terry shrugged, was I don't know, which is the right answer. And then Trish said, after World War II, which is also the right answer. Because the answer is, we don't know when it was written for sure. It definitely was written after, D-Day in 1945, right? And then it could have been written, probably not 5 minutes after that, right? Take some time to collect sources. So we could probably reasonably speculate that we're like 1946, 1947 at least, to when? To now. It could have been written all the way. So we have a pretty big span of time. But we know one thing for sure is that it's definitely written after the end of the events that it portrays. The next question we could ask ourselves is, where was it written? Or by whom was it written? And again, you'd need more information to answer that question, but you could probably make some guesses, right? You could look at what perspective the history takes on the Second World War. If it's a very pro-Allies, and especially if it tells, say, lots and lots of stories about the British infantry, you might speculate, I wonder if, a British historian wrote this. Feels like, that's somebody who cared about these stories. Or if every story happens in the Italian theater, which is a little out of the ordinary for a World War II history, and everything that's not in Italy is left out, you'd be like, well, I think this person kind of has a thing about Italy, right? So you might be able to find some clues, give you some hints about when it was written and where it was written and how it was written, and maybe even why it was written. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Set that aside for a second. Second analogy. If I was going to write a biography about, let's take Terry as an example. I'm going to write a biography about Terry. And I'm going to make this the most exhaustive biography anybody has ever written in the history of the world. And when I say exhaustive, what I mean is, I'm going to log every single second of Terry's life. From beginning to end, if he had eggs for breakfast, it's going in the biography, right? If he had a 4-minute shower instead of a 6-minute shower, it's going in the biography. You have really short showers, apparently. So here's my question for you is, how long is that book? How long is it going to be? How many pages? Like a billion, it's a billion, trillion, infinite, it's an infinity. Or here's another way to ask that question. If somebody wrote that book and I some pathological reason decided to read it, how long would it take me to read it? And the answer is, however long Terry lives, right? That whole time. Nobody's doing that. That's not possible, right? Nobody's going to write a biography or a history about an event or a time or a person or a place or an artifact or an idea that is exhaustive. It is not possible to write a truly exhaustive history. Like when I say it can't be done, I mean that in the literal sense of the word. It can't be done. So that means if you're going to write a biography about somebody, you're going to make some choices. You're going to choose, I'm going to tell this story, and I'm not going to tell that story. I might not tell the story about what somebody has for breakfast every single day, unless the thing that that person has for breakfast has some kind of like material bearing on a broader part of the narrative. And what that means is we're just like making choices. Yeah, it'll pop back on in a second. I think I bumped my cord over here. Is the issue? Oh, did it? Yeah, it's on the right thing. Anyway, this is the thing my computer does sometimes. We don't need it quite yet, but oh, there we go, beauty. So like these two things that I've just mentioned, these two analogies, they're here to sort of help us to think about what we can know about a history based on relatively limited information, right? Given the information at hand. So why does this matter for the books that we're talking about, for Joshua, Judges, Samuel? Well, we're really talking about Samuel and Kings, but Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. I'm gonna make a case in a minute. We're not quite there yet, but I'm gonna make a case in a minute that these books are related to each other in terms of their internal structures, their theology, that there are links, like overt and intentional links between them that are tying them together really on purpose, especially Samuel and Kings, but Joshua and Judges as well. To such a degree that it feels like it's purposeful. Like it really feels like it's purposeful. So that's one piece of information. A second piece of information is these books are, well, they have titles, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Those titles are actually all much, much later than the actual works themselves, right? Those are well after even the time of Jesus is when we started to call these books, any books in the Bible, by names. They were just manuscripts before then. And even in, for example, a Hebrew Bible today, the name of a book is just usually the first word in Hebrew of the book, right? So the name of Genesis isn't Genesis, it's Bereshit, because Bereshit is the first Hebrew word in the beginning, or when God began. That's how the book starts. And that's pretty normal all through. So the name of the book is actually not historical information, doesn't tell us anything. So that's one issue. The second thing about these books is they do not at any point record their author. None of these four books say, I so-and-so wrote this book at this time. And for a pretty good reason. By and large, nobody did that in the ancient world. We have a way of thinking about authors that is actually quite historically bizarre compared to every other human ever. And even most other cultures in the world today. Like we're really fixated on, on having our names on the front of a book. Like that's we care about that, and we probably, there are good reasons to care about that. It's not inconsequential. Especially ancient authors, like back into the Bronze and early Iron Age, like these books. It just isn't how anybody thought about anything. There's a very, very small number of people who are literate at all. And we don't know exactly. We usually estimates are usually somewhere between 10 and 15% of people are what we would call highly literate, so literate enough to write a book. It's a really small number of people, and they're professionally literate. That's what they do for a living. So I usually liken them to like a plumber today. Like very few people, if they get a leak in their house, know what to do. Most people phone a plumber. That's how almost everybody in the ancient world would be about reading and writing. It would never occur to anybody that you would have a society like ours with functional 100% literacy. If you could take a time machine back to 1000 BC and tell somebody about that, they would be baffled by it. It would be like somebody coming to our time and place and saying, oh yeah, no, everybody in our society is also an HVAC repairman. Like it should be a really bizarre thing. And so because it's such a small number of people who are literate, they sort of have their own rules and their own procedures for how they write things. And also they don't tend to think in strongly individualistic terms. Ancient authors tend to think, all ancient people tend to be a little more collectivist than we are, sometimes a lot more collectivist than we are, and ancient authors probably basically everything in the Old Testament, or the majority of what we have in the Old Testament, has gone through a bunch of hands before it comes to its final form. And so the best way probably to think about authorship is like schools or groups of scribes who are working together to do. And there probably are like people running the show who maybe we want to think of as like a primary author or like the editor or something like that, like the boss man. But it isn't like the work of a single intentional genius. Is probably not the best way to think about it. So what we've probably got with Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings is an intentionally edited together history. So somebody wrote this, a group of people probably wrote this, potentially over time, but I think probably within a relatively short period of time, and most people think in a relatively short period of time, and they've got a real specific goal. They have a story they're trying to tell, and they have a reason they're trying to tell their story. So how could we figure out why and when and where they're telling this story? So let's go back to our World War II example, right? So we know the World War II book is written after 1945. How can we figure out when Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings is written? Well, let's take a look at the end. Let's go flip to the last page of Kings. So if you crack open your Bible app or your Bible or whatever you want to use, and go to 2 Kings. Where are we? 2 Kings 25, right to the very end. So 2 Kings 25 is, it tells two stories. The first story that it tells is the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And sort of the surrounding moment. So it maybe covers some stuff that goes right down to 582, but basically 586 BC, which is the moment that the Babylonian Empire breached the gate, or they breached actually a side door in Jerusalem, and they entered the city, and they did a lot of horrible things to a lot of people, and they wrecked the walls, and they burned the temple, and they burned the palace, and so on and so on. And they take a whole bunch of people away to captivity in Babylon. And that's one of the big stories you get in chapter 25. And then the other story that you get in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah is, I'm not good enough at math to do that off the top of my head, but that's going to be 598 minus 37, 561. So, and I know it's 561 because Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, was king for about 3 months in Jerusalem, but he wasn't the last king when Jerusalem was destroyed. That was Zedekiah. Jehoiakim was the king right before Zedekiah. Zedekiah is actually Jehoiakim's uncle. Jehoiakim was king for a couple of months, and the Babylonians took over the area, and they took Jehoiakim away into exile, and they did that in 598 BC. And so 37 years after 598 is 561. So in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, so that's going to be 561, maybe 560, depending on how the months shake out. In the year of Awel-Marduk, the year that Awel-Marduk became king of Babylon, he released Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived. So the last thing that happens in the story in 561 BC is that Jehoiakim, who has been imprisoned, like actively imprisoned, probably under like intense house arrest, is allowed to roam around in the city. This has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight, but just a fun archaeological fact. We actually have like a logistical document from ancient Babylon from this time that actually has like essentially a shopping list for King Jehoiakim's house. So we know like we've got some secondary corroboration, which is always nice to have, which we don't always have about a lot of these stories. But we've got some secondary corroboration about that too. So when was the Book of Kings written? Well, I don't know, but also definitely after 561 BC. So 561 is the last event that it records. And that would mean that the earliest Kings could have been written is in the exilic period, or maybe the very early post-exilic period. So if somebody made me guess, I would say, I think that the history that we've got here, Joshua through 2 Kings, probably in its final form dates from sometime in the middle to the late 6th century BC. So between 550 and 500 BC is that would be my guess. And actually I would put probably pretty good money on that bet. I feel pretty confident about that. That some legitimately significant form of the storytelling was finalized at that moment. Now, does that mean that all of the content of these books is written then? No, obviously not. Because let's go back to our World War II example. If you wrote a World War II history, do you have to write all of the information completely brand new? Well, no, you're going to use some sources, right? How do you know these things? You have source material. And you're going to include that source material probably sometimes at length, sometimes you're going to summarize it, sometimes you're going to adjust it because of your particular perspective. That's probably what is going on in the Deuteronomistic history too. So when I keep saying the final form, the actual final form of the 4 books is probably from the late exilic period, but there's stuff in this that's old, really old. From the 10th, 11th, 12th century BC, probably. We tend to think, especially like the David material, or at least the core of the David material, probably was written during David's lifetime, because some of it reads kind of like royal propaganda. It reads like the kind of thing you would write if you would just become king and you would like everybody to be okay with you being king. It reads a little like that. And so a lot of people assume that there's chunks of the David story that come, or the Solomon story, there's chunks of the Solomon story that probably were written while Solomon was king. But they weren't collected together into one big history until later. And so the history that we've got, on the one hand, probably from the late 6th century BC, but it's also built from pieces that are a little earlier.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is it only in Chronicles that you hear references like the rest of the story is told in the annals of the kings of Judah or something like that?
Yeah, there's a couple of places in Kings and mostly in Chronicles, though, where you have these references to something else. Like the annals of the kings of Judah, or the Chronicles of the wars of Judah, the kings of Judah, I think it's called. There's a few, so that tells us a few things. First of all, it tells us this is not the only piece of history writing that the ancient Israelites did, which is, it's not interesting really from a theological perspective, but it's super interesting from a historical perspective. It also tells us that the chronicler, for example, is using, he overtly tells us he's using sources. One of them, the primary source he's using, is Kings. And in fact, he is really regularly just cribbing word for word from Kings or Samuel. But he's also using something else too. And then sometimes he's also kind of making his own choices. So I'm not going to talk a lot about Chronicles, but let's talk about Chronicles just for a second. The chronicler we call, and it's a misnomer. It gives you the impression one person did it. The chroniclers is probably a better way. The group of people who gave us Chronicles, which again is an anonymous book. It's much later than the Deuteronomistic history. So we usually date it down to sometime in the 3rd century for too many reasons to go into right now. And it is using a bunch of source material to tell its story. And it is very similar in some ways to the Deuteronomistic history, to Joshua through Samuel to Kings, but it's very different in other ways. So some of the similarities, it copies many of the same stories. You get lots and lots of overlap of stories. Those are the main similarities. Now, differences are interesting. Chronicles is pathologically pro-David. Chronicles has nothing bad to say about David. If there's something bad that David did or said or could have done, the chronicler either leaves it out, or you'll notice actually in a couple of places, he pretty obviously is adjusting the story from Kings. He's I don't think we want to tell it that way. Because it's a very pro-Davidic document. Now, why would that be? Well, it's written in the Second Temple period when there's no Davidic king, and there's a very high degree of the beginnings of what we might call messianic hope, a desire to see a new king like David. So yeah, it's really pro-David, right? It's like if somebody wrote a story now in the United States of America about how badly we'd like to have another George Washington, and they go on and on about how great George Washington was, regardless of whether he always was or not. So it's a little it's got some of that tenor to it. Chronicles also has a much bigger focus on worship at the temple than Kings does. The books of Samuel or Joshua through Kings actually never. Hey, Bill, come on in, man. We're just chatting away.
Sorry, do I still graduate?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll give you a reduced diploma, I guess, or something like that.
Sorry.
You can make up some extra credits. We're just talking a little bit so
You
far.
didn't have to dress up for us.
I know.
Well, you're special. You are special. I was hoping to get me some points.
I always appreciate a purple tie, though. We're just talking about Chronicles and Kings for a second.
And we were talking about royalty, so the purple tie is complete.
Even better. I'm sure David wore royal purple ties. Oh yeah, I was going to say Chronicles also is really into temple worship, whereas Joshua through Kings, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, never says boo about what happens at the temple. Like there's the founding of the temple and kind of a description of a worship service there, but apart from that, it never tells us anything about like the mechanics of the tabernacle or the temple. It never really shows us anybody worshiping, with a couple of exceptions. But Chronicles tells us that lots, and it has David like writes songs and is very, very musical in Chronicles. He's a little bit in Samuel, but really in Chronicles. And we get all sorts of priests named as like singers in the temple, and you don't get that in Kings at all. So that's another pretty substantial difference between the two. So Chronicles is really like a very glowing, hopeful story that it's very nostalgic. It like looks back at the ancient history of the people of Israel, how great it was. And then it stops at the destruction of Jerusalem, but with the implication like, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could get back to that? So it's a very nostalgic history. Whereas Joshua through Kings is I don't know what's the right term, is really judgy. It's a very intensely condemnatory history because it's written. I was just saying to these guys that this history, Joshua through Kings, is probably all one history. And it's written probably at during the exile. It's written by people who have just had their entire lives destroyed, and they are trying to figure out what happened. Right?
So they're coming from with a PTSD.
They are. A lot of people actually do write about the Deuteronomistic history and some of the prophets from the perspective of trauma studies, because this massive societal trauma has occurred. These people have been dragged away into exile. Maybe they're coming back, but maybe not yet, and they're like, what? Dear God, what was that? Thank you. And they want to explain it. And the explanation, not to give away the end of the game, but the explanation that you're going to get out of the Deuteronomistic historian is, that was our fault. We did that. God did it, but we violated the covenant relationship, and this was the consequence of that. So Chronicles has got this really beautiful kind of nostalgia. It's very much like watching the Wonder Years or something like that, or some other old TV show. I'm like, oh, I loved back in those days. This less so. This is more like, oof, that was rough. We shouldn't do that again, or we should do it very differently. We should do it better if we're going to do it again. So there is this sort of fundamental difference between the two. Okay, is this making kind of some sense so far? Okay. So the reason I'm talking about this is because, while not all of the stories that we come across in Joshua through Kings are written at the end of the exilic period, they're all brought into the big narrative then. And so the story that's being told to us is this story of the Deuteronomistic history. So let's talk just for a second about the features that make us call it a Deuteronomistic history. What is it about Deuteronomy? What's going on in Deuteronomy that we see going on in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings? So the argument goes kind of like this. Let's talk about some key features of Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy is not the same as Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus. It's got lots of the same material, but it's got lots of different material too. And it has some really specific focuses, right? So one of them is an increase in the level of what we would call mediation in the covenant relationship. So the covenant relationship in Exodus is much more kind of direct between individual families of Israelites and God. In Deuteronomy, it's all through Moses. Moses is Moses is a big deal starting in Exodus through Deuteronomy, but you can imagine the trajectory of Moses' big dealness increases that entire time. And by the time we get to Deuteronomy, we're in maximal Moses mode. Moses is a really, really big deal. So the entire law is mediated through Moses more than anywhere else. There is no fire on the mountain. There is no theophany. There are no dramatic encounters between the people and God like there are in Exodus or Numbers, Leviticus. None of that happens in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is just God tells Moses what to say. Actually, God doesn't even talk, technically. If you really closely read Deuteronomy, God talks to Moses once or twice, but really Moses talks to the people. So Moses is telling them the law. So we have this increase in mediation with Moses, but we also have a pretty significant focus on the priests, the Levites. And that's something that you see carried through in that's a theme that will play out. It's a minor theme, but a theme that will play out in the Deuteronomistic history, where you'll get places in, say, Judges, especially the last few chapters of Judges. We get some stuff about the Levites, and you'll get stuff at the beginning of Samuel about a lot of it is about the failure of the Levites, but about the priests and the jobs they're supposed to be doing, what they're doing right, what they're not doing right. That's all kind of Deuteronomistic stuff. Lots of priesty things. Another feature that's really quite unique to Deuteronomy is what we call centralized worship. Worship only happens at the tabernacle and eventually the temple. And worship, the impression you get as you read Deuteronomy, it's almost like we know Jerusalem is someday going to be the home of the temple, and everybody's just going to worship there. You get that feeling in a variety of places. Whereas in Exodus, there are actually passages about how to set up like an altar to God anywhere. You're not allowed to do that in Deuteronomy. That's like kind of against the rules. And so what you get in Deuteronomy is this idea of like a unified land with boundaries and a central location for worship, and you're only really allowed to worship in the central location. Well, that's an important theme that gets picked up in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, especially in Kings, for example, with the building of the temple in 1 Kings 8. But then if you think about, say, the story of Josiah, we're not going to get there in our preaching, it's later on, but if you think about Josiah, the young man who becomes king, he institutes these really big reforms. What is he doing? He tears down all the places of worship everywhere else in the land, and you can only worship in Jerusalem. He centralizes worship, right? So it's a kind of a theme that he's very Deuteronomic. What else? The allowance for what we call profane slaughter. What a weird idea. What does this mean? If you read in Exodus, like in Exodus 20, the impression you get is anytime you kill an animal, literally anytime you kill an animal, you got to take it to the gates of the tabernacle and offer something to God. That is super impractical in a nation, right? Like that's fine if we're traveling around the camp and there's not that many of us and there's the tabernacle, you can kind of get there. But if you have a country, right, and it's like a 5-day walk from the north to the south, you can't go to the temple every time you kill an animal. And so when you get to Deuteronomy, there's an allowance for what we call non-religious or profane killing of animals. You can kill an animal and you don't have to go to the temple. And then there's other allowances for... So again, that seems like something that really has like a centralized temple in a city, in a big country. It seems to have those kind of structures in mind. So it seems to imagine the future a little bit. Deuteronomy is the only place in the Torah where you ever get a mention of a king of Israel. In fact, the Torah by and large is really anti-king. We don't need kings. We have God. We follow God. Moses tells us what to do. We don't have a king, except for Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20. And we're going to come back to Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20 a little later. So I'm not going to read it right now, but we'll come back to it. We'll get to Solomon. Hopefully, if we get time, we'll come back to it. Deuteronomy 17, we have an actual list of this is what a king should do. This is what a king should not do. And it's the only place you find that. So again, that seemed to tilt forward to, like, Tricia, I think you're thinking about doing like 1 Samuel 8 to 12, right? The story, like, do we want a king? Do we not want a king? Do we want a king? Do we not? That's a really big theme in Judges and early part of Samuel. The end of Judges, there was no king in the land. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But then you get to the early part of Kings, and Samuel's like, we don't really need a king. You have God as your king. And now we really want a king. You don't need a king. We really want a king. We kind of flip-flop back and forth. It is very reminiscent of the theology of Deuteronomy and like what a king should look like, what a king shouldn't look like. And in fact, one of the main themes, beginning as early as the later chapters of Judges, all the way through to the end of 2 Kings, one of the main themes of the Deuteronomistic history is what makes a good king a good king. Now, obviously, that's a bigger deal in Kings, right? Every single story is like, and so-and-so was a good king like his father David, or a bad king, like usually Jehoiakim. But it's a big deal in other parts of the story, too. All through the Samuel story. The Samuel-David comparison is mostly about what makes a good king a good king. The David-Solomon comparison, what makes a good king, all that kind of stuff going on. So that's very Deuteronomic theology. Oh, what else can we talk about? We're not going to talk, we can skip a couple of things here. There's still a lot of things. Okay, here's a big one. In the Torah, especially Exodus through Deuteronomy, but really all of Genesis through Deuteronomy, one of the key themes is land, the promised land. It's a big idea. And the way that I usually talk about it with students is, you can imagine kind of like, if you imagine like a set of scales with alternating weights, on one side of the scale you have the theme of land, and on the other scale you have the theme of ancestry or progeny, children and ancestry and where we come from. Genesis, all the weight is on ancestry, right? It's all about who's your father and how you're going to have kids and who's going to carry on the line. It's the promise to Abraham, I'm going to make your descendants like the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. It's all about who we are. That moves, and then the other scale is land. Like there is a promise for land for Abraham, right? A promised land. But Abraham just wanders around, and all of his immediate descendants all just wander around, right? As you follow through, though, Genesis through Exodus and then along, those scales start to tip, right? And by the time we're in Deuteronomy, we don't really talk about progeny because we don't really need to. We have a giant nation, and everybody knows who their dad is and who their grandfather and great-grandfather were way back, and we know what tribe we belong to and who we're supposed to be. And now it's all about land and where we're going to live. Where is this nation going to be? And so this key idea of land in Deuteronomy is deeply, deeply important, and it's deeply related to relationship with God. And this brings us to the last thing that's important to note is the book of Deuteronomy is a covenant, so it's a contractual relationship essentially between the people of Israel and God. It's got a bunch of stipulations, we call them. Here's the requirements, you got to do these things. These are the actual kind of laws. And then it's got a bunch of blessings. If you do all the things we just talked about, these are the good things that will happen. And it's got a set of curses. If you don't do them, these are the bad things that are going to happen. The good things and the bad things, the blessings and the curses, almost uniformly relate to safety and security of the land. And so the promise goes is if you follow God and you do the things in the covenant, then the borders of the land are going to be secure. The land is going to be fruitful, right? You're gonna have the grain is going to be fruitful. It even goes right down to, it says your kneading basket will give forth bread easily. Like it goes right down to like the wild yeast is going to be in your kneading basket and you'll be able to make bread all the time. That everything in the land from, the propagation of yeast in your kneading bowl to the birth of your children and everything in between, it's all related to your worship. If you worship well, good things will happen. But then the curses are the opposite of that, right? If you don't, and for the record, Deuteronomy is a really negative book, especially by the end. It basically is like, you guys aren't going to do this. It's not going to work. It's a real drag by the last few chapters. But it basically says, if you don't do this, then the land won't be fruitful. There'll be famines, or there'll be destruction. Your enemies will attack you, and they'll take things, they'll steal from you, and they'll destroy the borders of the land. And if you really don't listen, lots of people are going to die. And if you really, really, really don't listen, great armies are going to come and they're going to destroy the main cities, and they're going to take you away, and you're going to lose the land, right? So it really is like a foreshadowing of the end of the Deuteronomistic history. The thing that happens in 2 Kings chapter 25, that is the thing that Moses says will happen in the end of Deuteronomy. Right? So this is why we call it the Deuteronomistic history. It's taking a bunch of themes, and it is not like kind of borrowing them, it is quoting them really very regularly. Like I'm going to give you a list of theological transition points where we have like essentially quotations from Deuteronomy. You could look at Joshua chapter 1, you could look at Joshua 23, that's the beginning and end of Joshua, you're going to find things. You can look at Judges chapter 2 verse 6 to 3 verse 6, that's the main transition point into the actual judge stories in Judges. You can look in 1 Samuel 12, really 1 Samuel 8 through 12, you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff about kings and Deuteronomistic stuff. 1 Kings 8 is maybe the biggest of them all, which is the creation and dedication of the temple, which is just like big, huge quotations from Deuteronomy. The last few chapters of Deuteronomy are in there. You could look at 1 Kings 11, 29 to 39, which is the end of Solomon's time and the dissolution of the unified kingdom. 2 Kings 17, which is the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. and the Exile. So obviously we get a bunch of Deuteronomic language there, judgment language. Second Kings 21 and 24 to 25, where we have this sort of two-part telling of the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. And again, loads of Deuteronomic language in there. Overt and covert language there from Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is not the only theological source, but it makes up like 80-90% of the theology that undergirds Joshua to the end of Kings. So, like as a practical thing, wouldn't do you any harm to give Deuteronomy a read through before you go preach a passage, but at the very least just have these themes in your mind. Land, kingship, faithfulness to the covenant, the role of kingship in relationship to the covenant fidelity, those kinds of ideas they're gonna flow through all of these histories. Okay? Is this making sense so far? Any questions or clarifications or?
That last sentence, the role of kingship.
Oh yeah, as it relates to the covenant or to covenant fidelity, that flows through really deeply. In a meaningful sense, that's the only question that matters in the Deuteronomistic history about a king. Are they do they help the people keep the covenant or not? That's the only question that matters.
Did evil in the eyes of the Lord.
Yeah. Yeah, and doing evil in the eyes of the Lord means failing in covenant fidelity. And you could even say, that's not even don't think about that individualistically either. It's not like they personally failed, it's like they failed to keep the nation in covenant relationship with. That's one of the jobs of the Davidic king. It's not only the Davidic king's job, it's the high priest's job and the priesthood's job, the prophet's jobs, other people do it, but it's a big part of the gig if you're a Davidic king.
Buck stops with the CEO.
Yeah, and it is fair, and it's on this term. It's one of the really interesting things about. We're not going to do all the later kings in our sermon series. We're going to be with the early kings. But if you go read the later kings, they tell the story of basically all the kings of Judah and Israel, and they don't tell some stories that an historian would expect them to tell because they skip over some guys that are actually much bigger deals. Like Omri is the best example. Omri gets like a short bit in 2 Kings somewhere, I can't remember which chapter, and it's not he doesn't seem like a main character in the story. He was by far the most famous king of Israel, historically speaking, for other nations, because he was the most powerful and the wealthiest, and he extended the territory the most, and he's one of the only kings that gets mentioned by external historical documents. To most of the other nations around Israel, nobody cares about Israel. It's like a tiny little postage stamp. It's like barely bigger than a tribal chieftain, these kings. Like they're tiny. But Omri gets significant mention because he's a really big deal. But the Book of Kings doesn't really care about him. Because from their perspective, he's a bad king. Even though he's one of the most politically successful kings they ever had. So right, that gives you a sense of, that goes back to the thing we were saying before about what a history writer is trying to do. Yeah. The time and attention that different characters get is in proportion to what the history writer is trying to tell you, which is not necessarily the same thing that a different history writer would try to tell you, right? If you had a Moabite history writer, they're not going to say the same things that this history writer, because they care about different things. Okay?
Well, even history was one of my favorite subjects at high school, but I remember being told early, the version of history you're told will be influenced by the political attitude of the history teacher.
Oh yeah, of course. Every history is motivated.
Or the other one is history is written by the victor.
Yeah, absolutely. And these things, these are all just helpful and true things that we know about history that everybody should understand. Hopefully, yes, the historian of Joshua to 2 Kings is trying to tell you a true story, a set of true stories, but very much from a certain perspective.
Yeah.
And so they're going to leave some stuff out, they're going to put some stuff in, they're going to zoom in on some stories and they're going to really slow things down and give you a long series of events in some places, and other places are just going to skip over stuff. You're like, well, but what if that sounded interesting? And it's because it's not what they want to talk about, right? And you can if you pay careful attention, you can uncover their theological, ideological motivations, right? And they definitely do. And that's why I'm saying knowing the end of the story is a big part of that, right? If you know the story ends in disaster and the historian isn't that interested in making you feel better about that, there's a little ray of sunlight at the end where Jehoiakim gets released from, and you're like, maybe things will get better. But he's still in Babylon. They're still in exile. It's a pretty dark ending because that's what he wants. He wants you to process the whole history from that perspective. What did we do wrong? We did something wrong, right? So like I said, it's kind of a guilt-inducing history, which you need to process and think about a little bit. Okay, so I would say the Deuteronomistic history overall is a movement from a positive beginning. Joshua is probably the most positive book in all of them, to an ever-deepening level of forgetfulness and idolatry and eventual destruction. And there are moments of significant recovery in there, right? Like the early parts of the David story, for example, or Hezekiah or Josiah. There's some peaks, but it's mostly valleys. And the valleys get deeper and deeper as the story goes along, right? And it has this sort of dark, dark ending. So the books tend to begin with the ending of the era described in the preceding book, and then they bridge you into the next one. Through really quickly. The story, because I want to show us some of these transition points mostly. So we're going to go through Joshua Judges pretty quick here. Joshua, important transitional moments in Joshua. Chapter 1, chapter 23, 24. Chapter 1 is that the famous, be strong and courageous. This is the land the Lord your God has given you. So it's very much like, let's go in and take this land all together. And then Joshua 23, 24, the very famous, choose this day whom you will serve. Are you going to serve the Lord your God, or are you going to go back and serve the gods of Egypt? This is what Joshua is about. It is about like a shining moment of victory. The land is given to the people as a gift. Are they going to just run in there and take it? In like this glorious moment. And it feels very unified. One of the things you'll notice about Joshua, which we'll skip over quickly, but one of the things you'll notice about Joshua is that Joshua is about the nation of Israel. They're all together under Joshua's leadership, and they do everything together. And even what one person does that's wrong impacts everybody, right? So it's a big focus on unity. And we near the end, we also have the divvying up of the actual land into the tribal sections. And so we have this sense of like, you are being given ownership of this beautiful land. And so it really feels like, and Joshua is arguably the most Deuteronomic of all these books, and it really feels like the blessings of Deuteronomy are coming true here, right? We are receiving, because of our faith, the blessings of Deuteronomy. But then you move to Judges, which is arguably the darkest book of these four books, but it's, certainly one of the darkest books. Judges and Kings are really, really, really rough to read, and very sad and painful. So Judges, it has three big sections. It's got a prologue, it's got an epilogue, or a set of early tales, and then it's got the meat from 3 to 16. Those are the stories that you grew up with in Sunday school. Those are like what I call flannel graph Judges. Like that's you saw the VeggieTales version or whatever it was when you were a kid. You saw some version of this in Sunday school. We tell these stories because they're fun and exciting, and we often tell them incorrectly. Unfortunately, they're mostly pretty negative stories. This is probably the most R-rated part of the Bible, but anyways. The prologue is mostly about the failure to transition from one generation to another, the covenant relationship, right? There arose a new generation who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done in Israel, right? And this is like the death of Joshua. Joshua, ironically, dies twice in Judges. I mean, his death is mentioned twice in Judges, because we're trying to emphasize this, right? His death is mentioned in Joshua too, because we're trying to emphasize that with the loss of Joshua, who was kind of our last connection to Moses, like a really direct connection to Moses, the Israelites are kind of at sea, and they don't know what to do. And then the actual stories of the Judges is this ever-deepening spiral of destruction, over and over and over again. Every story takes basically the same path. It's got a series of, depending on how you count, 7 to 10 kind of key features. And as you progress through, any of the good features that you got at the beginning in the early Judge stories like Ehud, they start to fall away. The only really like purely good story of a judge is the story of Othniel, which is the first one. It's like 6 verses long or something like that, and it doesn't really say much. And then every other story they get bigger and longer as you go along, and they get worse, and the judges get worse and worse and worse until you get to the end with Samson, who is functionally indistinguishable from a Canaanite. But you really can't tell the difference between Samson and a Philistine. They look identical. Which is the irony, right? Because the Philistines are the ones he's constantly killing. But he's so indistinguishable from a Philistine that his own people, the Israelites, the Benjamites, trying to hand him over to the Philistines. Like, we don't want this guy. He's no good. So he's a pretty bad dude. And then you get this set of what I call the early tales in Judges 17 to 21. The worst stories in the Bible, right? The most horrible stories in the Bible, which is the point. And the point you get out of the early tales at the end of Judges is that everybody did what was right in their own eyes, and there was no king in the land. And there's like a connection between those two things. There's no king, there's nobody that provides leadership, and so the whole thing comes off the rails. And one of the points of interest in the early tales is both of those stories focus on Levites, on people who were supposed to be worship leaders, priests, and they are monsters. They are horrible people. Like the story of the silent woman or the Levite's concubine. You have this awful, awful person who like enslaves, has like a sex slave, and then she escapes and he goes and recaptures her, and then he like gives her to a bunch of people who want to rape him, and they essentially kill her, and he cuts her body up into pieces. And that's not even like the worst part of the story. There's more awful from that. And all of this is a story of the failure, like the absolutely bedrock fundamental failure of all of the structures of Israel. Nothing is working, right? So it's like in many ways like the exact opposite of Joshua. I'm going to skip through the stuff that I've got here for a second. Don't mind trying to give everybody motion sickness. Okay, so let's move out of that into Samuel. And so let's actually talk about Samuel himself, because Samuel is a super important figure and a really interesting figure. And Samuel is a good way to think about the relationship between the book of Samuel and the book of Judges. Because Samuel is a judge. If you watch him and see what he does, he's a priest, he's a judge, he's a visionary or a prophet, and he isn't a king, but he sure operates like one a lot of the time. So Samuel is kind of like all things to all people. He's like the great hinge between the time before the kings and the time of the kings. And so what we get with Samuel is really the last judge. And so you can imagine in 1 Samuel 1 to 12, which is the part of the book of Samuel that's really about Samuel. He's the main character for those chapters. Saul starts to become a significant character around chapters 7 and 8. Samuel, in many ways, as a character, really belongs to the book of Judges in lots of ways. And many of the themes of the book of Judges carry through very smoothly into the book of Samuel, including especially there is no king or there's no leadership in the land, there's no significant judge that anybody can depend on. We were probably in the time period of the later judges, and especially that key theme with the failure of the priesthood. The first several chapters of Samuel are really about the failure of Eli, the high priest, and Eli's sons. And if you look at the way that Eli's sons behave, they feel a lot like the judges of the book of Judges. Like they're just like amoral monsters that use other people for their own benefit. They're quite horrible. And again, the Israelites of these chapters are functionally indistinguishable from like Canaanites and Philistines, like other tribes around them. Like it's really like if you were like, what's the difference between the Israelites in this section and the people who steal the Ark of the Covenant? You'd be like, well, not much, frankly. They resemble each other strongly. That resemblance is going to go away through the course of Samuel and into Kings, but it's pretty strong at the beginning. So this is what I mean by like the very close relationship. It's like the two books are kind of clamped together at these themes. The beginning of Samuel and the end of Judges are pretty closely related to each other. Continuing on, 1 Samuel 12. I mean, you could say if you want to, 1 Samuel 8 through 12. This is the transition out of the time of the judges and into the time of the kings. So really, the big main transition in the beginning of Samuel happens about a third of the way into the book, where we have the people desiring a king because they recognize they don't have significant leadership. They're really worried about being conquered by other people. They're like, no, we need somebody to run the show for us. And Samuel's like, no, you've got God. They're like, no, we really need a king. And they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And we end up having the selection of Saul, which is a really interesting passage. We can't do a detailed dive into it, but some things to notice. Did you notice, does anybody remember from reading it why they choose Saul? Tall, yeah, he's the big guy. He stands head and shoulders above everybody else. He's the big, tall guy. He hasn't proven himself in battle. He hasn't demonstrated that he's any kind of particular religious leader or even a leader at all, but he's a big guy.
Yeah, God's a Messiah.
Well, yeah, ish, right? This is one of the interesting things about this subsection. If you read chapters 11 through 12, at least I think, and most scholars think, you actually kind of get a feel that the narrator in each chapter is kind of flip-flopping back and forth. Sometimes on Saul's team, sometimes really anti-Saul. And the reason for that is probably, if we go back to our conversation about source material, probably the historian has two sources. And one of them is pro-king, one of them is anti-king. One of them is like a theocratic, we want God as our king. And the other one is, no, a king is quite a reasonable thing, like it's that Deuteronomy 17 kind of thing. And he's tried to sort of like stitch them together. And Saul comes out okay in some places. Like for example, he's made into sort of a visionary, he has like a prophetic, ecstatic experience when he wanders around with the prophets. So there are places, and he is sort of, at one point it feels like he's set aside by God, but at another point it really feels like it's the people who choose him. And especially that second theme will play out later as in his failures. It'll be like Samuel's like, not, this guy isn't my problem. You guys did this. You picked this idiot. So there is this sort of tension, and you're right to pick up on it. And we can even, this is something you can think about as you're thinking about preaching it. It's even an interesting tension that you could point out because we're like this as people. We sort of want this, maybe we don't want this. Are we making a decision, or are we making it just for like completely earthly, worldly reasons? And we flip-flop a little back and forth. Like that's a true thing about human beings. We're really like this. But the big reason, one of the big reasons they pick him, eventually he is anointed by, and he is confirmed as God's choice to lead. But one of the big reasons they pick him is because he's big, which I'll come back to in just a second. But one of the things you get out of the subsection that is important in terms of the pro-king argument is if the kings fear the Lord, everything's going to be okay. Right? It goes back to, okay, we've got a king now. What does that mean? And so again, you can go back to Deuteronomy 17 and read the requirements of a king and get a feel for what it would be. Like what are the standards by which Saul is going to be judged? Right? And it really does come down to, is he going to maintain covenant fidelity? Which, of course, he's not, because he's a troubled, complicated kind of guy, right? Okay, skipping ahead in the Saul story a little bit. We usually start the story of David in 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17 to 31 is what we call the succession narrative, or the story of the rise of David. So we begin with the sort of famous, again, Sunday school stories of David. David the shepherd, David the minstrel, David the killer of Goliath. And now here, the Goliath story is a really, really interesting story to me. And here, hopefully I don't bother anybody too much here, but we'll see how it goes. The David and Goliath story is one that I think we misread substantially for a variety of reasons. First of all, we misunderstand how big Goliath is. We have a habit of thinking Goliath's like that, like we have like a 35-foot tall dude and little David. Not probably. First of all, he's measured in cubits in the original text. So a cubit is, there's two different kinds of cubits. There's the long cubit, which is from your elbow to the tip of your finger, and there's the short cubit, which is from your elbow to your wrist. And the other problem here is we actually have two different ancient manuscripts. We have the Hebrew manuscript and we have a Greek translation that's very, very old that represents a different Hebrew manuscript. And they give us two different heights for Goliath. Probably what's happening is one of them is giving us the height in the short cubit and the other is giving us the height in the long cubit. And it depends a little bit on how you shake things out, but Goliath is we're probably being told he's 6 or 7 feet tall. Now you're like, that's not a giant. I'm like, well, actually, in like the late Bronze Age in the Levant, if you're 7 feet tall, you are gigantic. Archaeologically, it seems like the average person was a little shorter than the average person is today. 5'2"-ish, 5'5"-ish, something like that. So you could probably imagine David when he's full grown is probably like 5.5 feet tall.
Well, and the people already picked Saul because he was tall, so there's obviously some societal recognition.
Bill is skipping to the next stage
Sorry.
of the story. No, that's perfect. It's perfect. You're seeing the right connection, right? So when you get to the conversation about what's going on in the David Goliath story, this is indicative of the way that the historian thinks about kingship. So we have this guy Saul, who's head and shoulders bigger than everybody else. How tall is that? Like 6, 7 feet tall. And then we have this guy Goliath, who is like 6, 7 feet tall. Big, big guy with fancy armor. Who else has fancy armor in the story? Saul has fancy armor in the story. So we have two big, strong, powerful men with fancy, high-tech armor. One of them is out on the field calling on people to come fight him, and the other one is hiding in his tent. And the one that's hiding in his tent is the king of Israel, who's supposed to be out on the field of battle doing the job. And this is one of the things we're going to come at. The kings in the ancient world aren't meant to be warriors who lead from the front. This is like a basic assumption about ancient kings. Not all of them do that, but that is like a societal value in the ancient Near East. That you lead, when we're going to come up against this with David again later, when it's time to go to war, the king goes to war with the army. And we're seeing a failure here. And the historian is painting this as a failure of leadership, but much more importantly, in the same breath, as a failure of fidelity. He is being unfaithful to God. He doesn't believe that God will protect him. He believes he'll be killed if he goes and fights Goliath. So he's terrified of him. And David shows up. And so the story here really is not David the good guy and Goliath the bad guy. Goliath is not the antagonist in the David and Goliath story. Goliath is like a piece of scenery in the story. He's a tertiary character at best. He's just there to create the tension. The protagonist is David. The antagonist is Saul. David is faithful, small, no armor, no sword, just a sling, but faithful. Saul has all the advantages, but unfaithful. And one of the things that the historian is trying to do is, it's a little bit of an I told you so moment. It's a little bit like the historian like neenering the people for choosing Saul. It's like, I told you. Big and strong isn't what we need. What we need is faithful. Oh, you mean small and faithful? No. That doesn't matter. Big doesn't matter. Small doesn't matter. The being good with the sword, that's not what we're going for. What we need is fidelity. Covenant fidelity. And so when David comes onto the field, the whole story is about how faithful David is to God. How he trusts. He's like, what are you guys? Cowards. You're not going to go out there and fight for it. All of his rhetoric, some of which is quite insulting, is all about the faithfulness of God. And that becomes the through line of David's story, right? Through line of David's story is that he's going to be like pathologically faithful to God through the early part of his story. From about 1 Samuel 17 to about 2 Samuel chapter 7, he's going to be faithful all the way down the line. That's going to change later. But he's going to be faithful all the way down the line here. And that's going to be the thing he's praised for. David is a messy, complicated fellow, even in these parts of the story. He has these conflicts with Saul. Saul tries to murder him several times. And then David runs away. And everybody skips over this part of the story. That David becomes, for all intents and purposes, like a Philistine guerrilla warrior. Like he goes and joins the Philistines, and he's like in charge of one of them. He's like Robin Hood and his merry men, if Robin Hood and his merry men were terrorists functionally. And so he's like wandering around the land, like killing people and fighting people, and he's very Philistine for quite a while. In fact, for most of the heroic chapters of David's life, he's a Philistine. And he engages in these sort of tribal battles against mostly other people, not usually the Israelites, but then Saul's chasing him. And the funniest part, you can go and read this yourself, but the funniest part of the story is that, at least I find it hilarious, Saul is always chasing David and can never find David. Any other character in the story, if they want to find David, it's like, he's right there. Like if Jonathan wants to find David, he's like, I'm going to go find David. and then there's like the next scene, he and David are chatting, but like Saul can't find David with a GPS. Like he's got no hope at all of finding the guy. So, but I mean, all of this is kind of meant to give you the impression that it's the way I sometimes talk about it. It's like imagine a chessboard, and David and Saul and Jonathan, they're all pieces on the chessboard, and God is playing both sides of the board. And he's like moving here, moving there, and this is going to happen, this is going to happen. We're going to move everything around so that it is the way that God wants it to kind of turn out. That's really how God never gets mentioned a single time as like doing. God does not act directly in most of these histories. They talk about him, they pray to him, they ask for things, but it's not like apart from some of the prophetic stuff, it's not like God does things very much. But you can like feel the hand of God kind of behind every moment of the story. Anyway, and then we get to Saul's death. And the most important thing to understand about the death of Saul is that David is not there. Right? And that has to be the case. Because this is the story of a succession from Saul to David, and David is not Saul's son. David is not supposed to be the next king. And so one could be forgiven for thinking that David is a usurper, because he kind of is. But this, like, remember I said it's a little bit like Davidic propaganda? It's like telling the story about David after David's been made king. It's like, no, David didn't kill Saul. David wasn't even there. Not only was David not there, David was in the literal other side of the country. He was many days away fighting Philistines, because, you got to be fighting Philistines. That's important. And it's Philistines who kill Saul, and Jonathan dies heroically, and Saul has a complicated death, right? And we go back and forth. Is it heroic or is it cowardly? It's hard to tell. It's complicated, like Saul. I would say, that's my main perspective on Saul. People are like, is Saul good? Is Saul bad? I'm like, Saul is complicated. And in that sense, I actually feel a kinship with Saul. Because his mistakes feel like the kinds of mistakes that I make, right? And his triumphs are like, oh, good for you, buddy. But he's also just a moron sometimes, and it's a little frustrating to read. You're reading along, you're like, that happens, and that's fine. But in many ways, I think that Saul is one of the most human characters, and he reminds, he's a guy who reminds me of just like people. David, in the rise of David is very action movie hero. The only, I think, really, really good character in the entire history is maybe Jonathan. Jonathan's like a unilaterally good dude. Jonathan's just a good dude. Though he does die, of course, in the end. Okay, and then we get to Saul's death, and we have a succession crisis, which is 2 Samuel 1-7. So notice, we're transitioning books from 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel, but we're not really. The only reason there's probably a 1 and a 2 Samuel is because of length, because you can't put all of this on one scroll. So it's really Samuel's one book. But there is this sort of interesting transition. They decided to put the scene not at the crowning of David as king. They decided to put the scene at the death of Saul. And there's still more complications to come after that. So Saul dies, and David is made king of Judah, and Ishbosheth, Saul's son, is made king over the northern tribes of Israel. Now, in defense of the northern tribes of Israel, Ishbosheth is the king's son. It actually does make sense that he's made king. And then we have sort of a civil war, our first civil war. David wins eventually, and the means by which he wins are real sketchy. But David wins. You can go read that stuff in there about some of his generals and the sketchy things they do. Some murdering and some backstabbing and so on, and front stabbing, and side stabbing also. Lots of stabbing. But eventually David wins. And David is anointed king over all of Israel. Now, just as an aside here, it's worth noting that Israel is still like 90% a tribal coalition at this point. They're much chieftains. And so that's what you get when you get the bit about, just before, I think it's in chapter 5 and 6, where David is finally anointed king. You'll notice it's almost like by election. It's almost like the other tribal chieftains, the heads of the families, like they choose him. Because that is kind of what happened. That's how it worked. Eventually that will go away over time, and it really will be like a true monarchy, but we're just starting it out here, okay? Mm-hmm. And then we have 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Davidic covenant. This is, again, one of those absolutely foundationally Deuteronomic sections. It is probably the single most important passage in the book of Samuel, in terms of the theology of the book of Samuel. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I can give it to you in a nutshell pretty easily. So this is a covenant relationship that God makes specifically with David and with David's offspring, right, with David's children. And what it is a promise that the house of David will rule over the people of Israel. And God basically marries that covenant to the Mosaic covenant. He's like, look, the Mosaic covenant is the relationship between Israel and God, and now we're going to have this secondary covenant that's built on top of it that keeps the primary covenant running. And so at this point, this is actually the second of two secondary covenants. The first is the covenant with Levi. So now we now have the Levites, the priests, and the Davidic kings, and their job, both of them together, is to maintain the Mosaic covenant. And so that's basically, the promise is that God is going to make David's name great, that his children will build a temple, a place to worship, that there will be a promise of security and rest for David's children, and that this will endure perpetually, in perpetuity. And here we can come to, the phrase isn't actually used here, but this is an idea about David that's common that we need to talk about for just a moment, which is the very famous phrase that David is a man after God's own heart. Right? It's probably something you've heard somebody say about David. Usually when we talk about David and we say that David is a man after God's heart, what we mean is he's such a super good guy. Right? Be like David, because David is like God, or is like just the kind of person that God wants people to be.
Or a type of Jesus.
Or a type, and eventually that will play into he's a type of Jesus, which and we can hang on to the type of Jesus stuff in certain ways. The problem is, an actual careful reading of David's life is it complicates that idea that David is just the way God wants David to be all the time. David is seldom the way that God wants David to be. And David is frequently in violation of many different tenets of the Mosaic covenant. So how could it possibly be that God would say this guy who's very complicated and often bad is a man after God's own heart? Well, the problem is we're probably misunderstanding the expression. So first of all, let's talk about heart in Hebrew. Heart, which is lave in Hebrew, your lave. So the ancient Hebrews do not have a word for mind or brain like we do. And this is in large part because ancient peoples, not just the Hebrews, but most ancient people, do not think of the thing in your head as the center for reason, rationality, and will. They think of this. Actually, probably this, like this part of you. All together, this is where your will comes from. And if you're talking about your deep emotional self, like your instincts, that's more like your bowels and your guts. That's where that. And just think for a minute, and you can see why they have that logic. Because when you have like an immediate moment of insight, you get a flutter, right? You get like a heart, and the reason for that is, of course, because you get a dump of like adrenaline or something like that into your bloodstream, and your heart went right? Or if you feel an instant moment of dread, you're like, your bowels like suck up on you, right? You feel it in your guts. And of course, we know biologically why that happens. It has to do with fight and flight reflexes. But it's easy to imagine that you would then start to associate those parts of your physical body with these ways. So when you hear heart in the Old Testament, you should probably think of the center of reason and emotion in a person. A kind of combination of mind and soul and what we might call heart. Because when we say heart, we just mean like emotions, right? If somebody is like a person after my heart, they're like, that's just how I want people to be. But if heart means like my center of will and reason and decision making, and I say somebody is a person after, like what if I said somebody is, a person after my mind? I'm kind of saying they're like a person I chose, right? They think like me, or I want them to move in a certain direction like me. And that's probably what the phrase, a man after God's own heart, means. What it means is the person the heart of God chose. It's a statement about election. And so the real contrast here is not between David and like the moral character of Jonathan or Saul or Solomon or anybody else. It's about the way that Saul was chosen versus the way that David was chosen. Right? Saul is chosen kind of in this complicated, the people want him sort of way, and doesn't end well. So the next king he's not just chosen by God, he's like chosen completely in secret by God. God's like, hey Samuel, get some oil. And you see that field over there? No, the one after, nope, the one after that. Okay. The one out in the middle of nowhere. Go over there, and I'm going to show you the kid. He's like, that guy? No. That guy? No. That guy? That guy? That guy? Not that guy. That guy. And then and God's like, he's the king because I picked him. It is that David doesn't have any qualities that make him David. Apart from God picks him and he responds appropriately. Right? And so when we say that David is a man after God's own heart, and when we say that David is the one to whom the Davidic covenant is given, we are talking about a gift of grace freely given to David that David then enacts, right? And so this is just exactly the same way in the New Testament we think about grace. We are not brought into the family of God because I'm not brought into a relationship with Jesus because I'm just the best, right? I like David, I am a man after God's own heart. I'm a guy who chose. Now, that places a burden of responsibility. And it did for David too, right? And for all of his progeny. It places the burden of responsibility on how they're going to act now. But it's not like they were great and so they're picked and now they're going to continue to be great. No. They were picked. And now they have responsibility. They have something to live into, which they frequently fail to live into, and that leads to bad things down the road a little bit, right? But are you tracking with me on this, like, a man after God's own heart thing? Which I find very helpful because it uncomplicates some pretty complicated problems. If you're like David really, or God really loves David and everything David does is the best, that can lead to some really bad interpretations of some pretty terrible stories. But this way we can be like, God chose David. And look, David is doing something terrible. And look, David is also doing something terrible there. Don't do the terrible things that David did, right? And that's fine, right? We can judge David by means of the same covenant that everybody else in Israel is judged by at the time, which is the covenant of Moses. Okay, nobody's doing any mighty men stuff with David, are they? We can skip over the mighty men. Anyways, the mighty men, the Gibeonim of David, they're a fun little side note. One of the reasons David wins so much is because most soldiers at this time period are like farmers who come and fight on the weekend when they need to. David's soldiers are professionals, and so that's why they win a lot. Because he hired a bunch of thugs who,
mercenaries.
They're mercenaries. They really are, and they kill people for a living and are, unsurprisingly, quite good at it. And so when you get a battle where it's like David with a relatively small force versus other guys, and David wins, it's kind of like if a 3-on-3 NBA team came against my like 5-man semi-professional team, we're gonna lose no matter what we do. Anyways, okay.
So maybe I should comment on that.
Jump in.
Well, I'm just looking at the way I've laid things out, and unintentionally, I know most of what you have said, but I think I've still unintentionally fallen into a little bit of a trap that could very easily lead us into a David is a great guy narrative.
Well, I mean, it depends on how you preach it, but yeah.
It depends on how we preach it. Certainly, we can be careful with that. But I've not done anything that's specific to the Davidic covenant.
Oh, sure, right.
And the mighty men would be. There's some really interesting stuff in that narrative as well. So I'm just wondering whether I should maybe go back and take another run after tonight at the sequencing to just maybe finesse.
I mean, we could. That's always an option. Or another way to approach this too is we could try to tell all of the David stories through the lens of the covenant with David and the role of David as king. I actually don't mind. I noticed all the stories that we're telling, and they're good stories to tell. And the way to avoid the trap of making David sound like this perfect heroic figure is just to tell the whole story when you're telling it, right? When you come up against a David story, there's always going to be some like David is awesome and a hero mixed in with some, whoa, why did David do that? And we should tell both parts. And that might lead us to ways to talk a little bit about the fact that, no, this isn't hero worship. We're telling the story of a late Bronze Age king in Israel, and it was a pretty...
I want to get the power supply.
You got it. And it was a pretty rough time, and so there's some sketchy things happen, but we want to parse this through the lens of the covenant of David, right? And we want to parse this through the lens of the Mosaic covenant, and we want to be honest with where David makes mistakes, which he does kind of a lot.
Just when you were talking about the man after God's heart, and God's selection, so is that a context some people would use the expression God's sovereignty?
Yes. Anytime we talk about election, we're talking about the sovereignty of God, God's right to make the choices God wants to make.
Now, I used to also hear an expression a lot in the brethren about being marked out.
Sure, which is probably another way of talking about
same thing, being marked out, almost before you were.
Yeah.
So that's a similar idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the way I would say it is, there are different ways that Christians over time have thought about the idea of election or selection. And this is how I would say it. First of all, being elected isn't like something you get for being special. Being elected is something that you get because of the sovereignty of God. Right. Secondly, election is usually a more of a burden than a blessing, is the frank truth.
It's not a reward.
It's not, and often it's pretty rough. Like the one way to say it is, if you go back to Genesis, say, and follow the Jacob-Esau story, is a really good example of election, where Jacob is elected to be, like, you know, he's not supposed to be the primary son, but it's a story about his selection as the progenitor of Israel. His story is terrible, and it's a bad story, and Esau's life is pretty sweet, actually. Like Esau, like the bathing's a little rocky, and it looks like Jacob kind of wins, but then Jacob has to run away, and Esau lives a pretty good life, and is comfortable, and Jacob lives a terrible life, and then eventually comes back, and Esau's like, hey, how are you? I'm fine, right? And this is what you actually really frequently see, is that the non-elected child is the one that was not called out for particular and special service. It's not always better to be not elected. Mm-hmm. And similarly with David, his election doesn't make his life better, but he's the tool that God needs and wants at the moment. And so God selects him and uses him. And he is sometimes a tool fit for service, and sometimes he is not. Sometimes he's just a tool. Yeah. Sometimes he's just a bit of a dummy. But he is the tool at the moment. And so when we talk about election, it is about God selecting people for God's purposes. And that is a conversation with sovereignty to a certain degree. And sometimes those are things that we're a little uncomfortable with. We really like the idea of our choices. Mm-hmm. And I understand why. The Old Testament authors are substantially less interested in that than we are. And they're not that bound up on like the logical problem of, do people have free will or not? They're like, yes, people have free will, but doesn't God make choices? Oh yeah, for sure. Wait, which one of it is it? And they're like, it's both. Don't worry about it. They just don't get that hung up on it. Anyway, before we get into Kings, which I'll do in a second, let's just talk for a second about the second half of Samuel, which is starting in 2 Samuel 8 and following, which is where David's life becomes substantially messier. And you could make the argument, and I would make the argument, that basically after David is made king, the wheels completely come off the wagon for him. And pretty much every story about David from that point on is a story of failure to some degree or another. And it begins with the story of the rape of Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11. There's a very famous story, and again, it's another one of those stories that we sort of don't read that well, in my opinion, for a variety of reasons, but a lot of it gets told like, you've got this temptress lady, Bathsheba, who makes David fall into sin. That is not actually how the story reads. If you read the story carefully, it begins with, in the springtime when the kings go off to war. So to go back to what I said before, David is a king. He's supposed to lead his army from the front, or at least with his army. He's supposed to go up to war. David doesn't go to war. He is now living this cushy life in Jerusalem. He's taken the capital for himself, and he's got this palace, and he's hanging out where he's not supposed to be, looking down on the private rooftops of other people, which he's not supposed to be doing. And he sees a woman bathing, she's bathing where she should be bathing. She's doing a perfectly normal and reasonable thing. And he uses his power to take her for himself. And people sometimes object to the use of the word rape in this case, but I don't really know that seems like the right word to me. If a person with power and authority forces another person to do something of a sexual nature, that is rape or sexual abuse of some kind. So I usually just call this the rape of Bathsheba. And so he brings her to his bedchamber and he sleeps with her. And it's very important to understand this is a patriarchal culture, and he's the king. She really does not have a say. And she's put into a deadly, dangerous, and horrible position. And David follows this up because everything gets complicated, because she's pregnant, and now everybody's going to find out, and what are we going to do? And she's worried because she's going to look like she is guilty of a terrible sin when she's been, in fact, put in an impossible position. And David's solution to this problem is to murder her husband. And not just he doesn't even, this sounds awful to say it this way, but he doesn't even murder him himself. The contrivance is cowardly, the way he enacts it is cowardly. And this is, in many ways, like kind of the first big David story after the Davidic covenant, right? Like they sort of, like there's a couple of like little in-betweeny things, but it's the first kind of big narrative that comes right after he's made king, and it is a story of just utter disaster. And it leads to death upon death. He's condemned by Nathan the prophet. And if you want to read about like why this is evil, just read the condemnation of Nathan the prophet. It's really clear that David is completely at fault. And then it has all sorts of terrible consequences for the entire nation, consequences for David himself, and the horror kind of plays out. And then from there, we just have a succession of stories of terrible family controversies. We sometimes call these the court intrigues, the court tales, where we have David's family, this big powerful family, and the continual violence and infighting and pain and suffering that pervades the entire family life. And I would connect that really intentionally to these sort of overt failures of David as a king. He does not, ironically, David himself is not a king like his forefather David, right? David himself does not enact kingship in much of his reign like he's supposed to. Now, there are places, there's some peaks and some valleys, right? So you can think of like the story of Absalom, his son, and the attempted coup and taking over the nation, which is pretty horrible. And there are moments in that story where David does seem to be more faithful. He tries to not kill his son. He tries to maintain some kind of unity in the nation. He's trying to hold things together, but even there, he is not succeeding well. And it's just a really ugly story, right? And everything is just bad through the story. So you can imagine this like succession of terrible things that kind of catch up with David along the way. In large part because, well, he's selected by God. He doesn't live into the destiny of the Davidic covenant, is the way I would interpret it. And that gets us to King and to Solomon. How are we doing for time? 9:30. Yeah, we're doing okay. We'll try to wrap it up pretty soon. Because we started a few minutes late. Okay, let's talk about kings really, really quickly. So, the Book of Kings does not start with Solomon as king. David is still king in the beginning of the Book of Kings. And so we actually get another one of these sort of clamp relationships between Samuel and Kings here, right? Like if you were imagining that Samuel was completely a standalone book and Kings was a totally standalone book, you'd probably have David die in Samuel and Solomon take the throne in the beginning of Kings. But instead we bleed the David story into Kings a little bit because we're trying to attach the two stories to one another. We see a profoundly diminished, sad, almost pathetic David at the end of his life. This weird thing with a concubine who's sleeping with him, who he never has sex with, and it's a hard passage to really interpret. But it's probably actually a bit of a dig at David, that on the one hand, it's immoral of him to have not his wife sleeping in his bed with him, and on the other hand, he isn't even enough of a man anymore to like be able to perform the act. So he's bad for doing it, but he's not even like virile enough. So it's a bit of a kind of dig both directions probably, but it does make him look good. And then we have this like succession crisis. Who's going to be the next king? Because David has held on to power for a long time and he hasn't really groomed an heir effectively because he's a failure as a father in the other part of the story. And so we've got this problem between Abinoam and Solomon, who's going to be king. It goes back and forth, back and forth. And if you read that narrative, it really, really, really reads like the Jacob and Esau story again. It really feels like Bathsheba and her son kind of like managing the politics with the help of Nathan and Zadok the high priest to sort of manage the right person into the job. So you've got some massaging, some managing, and David is just this old man who's sort of being led around by the nose. It's kind of a sad end. But eventually Solomon secures the succession, David dies, and then we have the beginning of the Solomon story. And however complicated David is, Solomon is much more complicated. Okay? And Solomon is a really tough guy. Solomon is hard to... he's hard to judge, is the way I would say it. So Solomon's really just the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings is the Solomon story. So first of all, think about how short that is. Like we think of Solomon as like a major figure in the Bible. He's there for like 7 minutes, man. Like he just takes no time to read a story. David gets a book, right? But like the majority of Samuel is about David. And Solomon gets like a few chapters of one book. He's a relatively small character, which is interesting. And even in those chapters, I would say the historian is kind of ambivalent about about Solomon. So Solomon is wise, but Solomon is also unfaithful, right? Solomon builds the temple, which is the greatest Deuteronomic achievement in the entire history. But Solomon also violates the commands for kingship completely and like leads people away from God. So he builds the temple, but he totally fails in his charge. Solomon is the one of the greatest political and military kings in the history of Israel. He extends the boundaries of the land farther than anybody else. Bigger army, more money, but he's also the last king of the United Kingdom, and his failures lead to a civil war.
Well, they says he wasn't a man of blood, so I didn't understand.
Sorry, what do you mean? Which bit?
Well, David couldn't build the temple because he was a man of blood. I didn't realize Solomon was a man of blood as well.
Well, he is, yeah. I mean, like, so yeah, the reason that David is given why he's not allowed to build temples because he is a violent person is the ostensible reason. And it says your seed will build the temple. So in a certain sense, Solomon builds the temple because that's what God said would happen. His seed will, your offspring is going to build a temple. But yeah, Solomon is not a warrior. He is a ruler, a strategist, a politician, very much a politician. And he does have an awful lot of blood on his hands there directly, if you know what I mean. So that might be part of the distinction. But yeah, but the impression, if you read like 2 Samuel 7, the impression you're going to is David's going to have this great and glowing line of people that come from him. But the first one of them, the historian is like, whew, this didn't turn out that great. This guy is complicated, and he's a bit of a mess. So even like a good example of this is the very famous story of Solomon asking for wisdom, which is a really interesting story. Which is like one of the main stories we know about Solomon. God says, ask for anything. And Solomon asks for wisdom, and if you just read the story, you get the impression like that was good. It feels like a good story, right? Just reading that story. But then you read the rest of the Solomon narrative, and you're like, but the wisdom didn't help him.
No, didn't help him.
He makes very smart, terrible decisions on a regular basis. And so one of my lingering questions is I wonder what the Deuteronomist, the historian, what does the historian think Solomon should have asked for? Does the historian think Solomon should have asked for wisdom? Or what is the thing that a king in the line of David needs beyond all of the things? What is the thing that David had, the one thing that David had that was right, which is fidelity? What if Solomon had asked for faithfulness instead of wisdom? But it's a tricky story because on the one hand, if you just read the story, it pretty clearly is a positive story.
Well, it seems to indicate that God's pleased with that request.
Yeah, it's like a good request. You've asked for a good thing. And it's important for us to say, in the biblical tradition, wisdom is good. But in the biblical tradition, wisdom is judged through the lens of fidelity. So if you read Proverbs, what is the beginning of wisdom? Is the beginning of wisdom smarts? No. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord.
Yeah.
Right? And so, so what is going on with Solomon? Is it a good request that goes sour? Very possibly. Or is it like he asks for like the second best thing? Which is some people interpret it that way, and that's an interesting interpretation. But in any case, the point I'm trying to make is Solomon is kind of a mess. And here I actually do want to really quickly go to Deuteronomy 17 for a second. So if you go to Deuteronomy 17, we can read about the strictures of kingship, the king, starting in verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. So the first qualifier is the Lord your God chooses the king. So that goes to the Saul story and the David story to a certain degree. He must be from among your fellow Israelites, so no foreigners. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, and incidentally, we're not going to get there, but that comes up in later king stories, right? There are some non- or quasi-Israelites that end up in charge of things in Israel. The king, moreover, and this is the stuff that really applies to Solomon. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you're not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. What are the things that Solomon becomes known for? For his great wealth. And the author in Kings specifies horses from Egypt. the author of Kings has read Deuteronomy. He is not, it's not an accident. He is citing Deuteronomy.
He's checking them against the
yes,
specifications.
yes, he's like, the specifications for Kings. No.
It's like having your legal department say,
Yes.
"You know that contract?"
Yeah. So there were 9 stipulations and you violated 10 of them. It's like really how it reads. Like you violated everything and find extra things to do wrong. And so like Solomon is famous for accumulating gold. He is famous for accumulating many wives. He's famous for accumulating horses. He enslaves his fellow Israelites, which is a radical violation of Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus. There's laws all over the place. You're not allowed to do these things. He's a complicated, messy guy, right? So he dedicates the temple, which is like arguably the most important like Deuteronomic moment is the dedication of the temple, and all that entire dedication is all about like if we worship, the land will be secure. But hanging over the entire dedication of the temple, I think, is the end of Deuteronomy, where you have the covenant violation curses. And most importantly, in my opinion, if you go back and read Deuteronomy, the end of Deuteronomy's got what we call a Song of Moses, this like psalm that Moses sings at the end, which starts off kind of nice, but mostly ends horribly. And it mostly is like a prediction of the eventual unfaithfulness of the Israelites. And it feels like I almost imagine if I was going to shoot a movie scene of the dedication of the temple, I would have the worship service and everybody's like big, glorious, powerful moment, and I would have like in the deep, deep background, so you could barely hear it, like a dissonant melody playing Moses' song. Like, this is not a happy scene. This is not a happy scene, because the author is writing from the perspective of a man who's seen that temple burned to the ground. And so it's a glorious moment for the moment, right? And then we get, of course, to his big failure, led into idolatry, in 1 Kings 11, and that's where we get like the overt prophecies of the destruction of the kingdom. And then immediately after that, we're going to get the actual dissolution of the kingdom, right? And now we're kind of at the end of the stories that I think we're kind of planning to tell more or less. We're going to get to the end of Solomon, and we're going to be done. So it's a bit of a drag to get to the end of the Solomon stories, but it is a very Deuteronomic thing to do, to kind of get to the end of the Solomon story and be like, and Solomon breaks the kingdom. Because he really does. I mean, the kingdom doesn't break while he's alive, but immediately upon his death, the kingdom breaks into 2 pieces and is never rejoined, right? And that is the end, functionally, of the nation of Israel. It is never reconstituted as its original self in all of history. And we sort of get to the end. Of the story there with Solomon's failure. And so, like, as we wrap it up, I just want to go back and revisit those points that I was trying to make at the beginning. So, first of all, the point of the Deuteronomistic history, right? That covenant fidelity is the most important thing, and the people of Israel failed in their covenant fidelity. Now, we as Christians could probably, and here I'm going to whiteboard it for just a second. We could probably talk a little covenant theology, and I'm going to do this really quickly and messily. So I'm not going to do the whole thing. But if we imagine like the main covenants in the Old Testament, so you've got the covenant with Moses, from Sinai down to Deuteronomy, and then you've got the covenant with Levi, which is meant to be supportive, right? This is like the priests who are supposed to support the Mosaic covenant. And then you've got the covenant with David, which we've talked about already. Again, a supportive covenant. In a significant sense, the Deuteronomic history is the history of this playing out in real life, and it plays out like that, right? It's just a big, long, and just ends in disaster. And the disaster that it ends in eventually, which again, we're not going to get to in our version of this summer, but it ends in exile. And I think the exile is like an ever-present specter in all of these stories. All the way down, the exile is there in the background, like this is all going to end really badly. We can feel it coming. Because we know it's going to end really badly. We know the end of the story already. Now, the way that I would maybe respond to this, if we're going to think about Christian theology in the New Testament, after the return from exile, so 539 BC, 538 BC, the people of Judah who are in Babylon start to, in waves, start to come back to Jerusalem, right? In the 520s especially, 520 down to 515, they come back to Jerusalem, they start to rebuild the temple bits at a time under Zerubbabel, and we have Ezra, and then we have Nehemiah that comes back, and over a century and a half or something like that, we rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls and rebuild the city, and there's a kind of version of Judah It's not really Judah. It's very small. It's not independent. It doesn't have a king. And there's even in this period, remember I talked about Chronicles as sort of hopeful for a Davidic king, really nostalgic for David. So Zerubbabel is the last descendant of David that we know about as a ruler, and he's governor of the region, but then he dies. We don't really know how. He vanishes from the story. And then there's no more Davidite. There's no more scion of the Davidic line to take over. And then we've just got this like group of people trying to make their way, and they're back from exile. And it begins to become apparent if you start to read religious literature from like the 2nd century BC, the 1st century BC, right around the time of Jesus, things like the Psalms of Solomon or the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, you start to get the impression that the people of Jerusalem and the surrounding area in Judah and Galilee think that we came back physically from exile, but foreign nations continue to rule over us. All of the curses of the Deuteronomic covenant seem to still be active. And so while we're back in body, are we really back in any meaningful sense? And this is when like there begins to develop a really sincere desire for somebody to come and fix this. And Messianism becomes really fully fledged in the 1st century BC. And I would say, I'm going to give you Matthew in like 10 seconds here. I would say that most of the New Testament authors have this as the background knowledge for them as they think about who Jesus was, right? They see Jesus, they meet Jesus, they live with Jesus, Jesus dies and is resurrected, and they're like, what is happening? And after his ascension, they're trying to like interpret what just occurred, and they interpret it through this lens. And they see themselves as having been in exile, and God doesn't send a great warrior, but he sends a Messiah. And this Messiah does a couple of things. First of all, this Messiah is like the embodiment of Israel. Israel personified and distilled down into a person. And this Israel lives and enacts the law perfectly, and is Israel the way that Israel is supposed to be, but then dies. And in a meaningful sense, by dying, what Jesus does is he fulfills the terms of the Deuteronomic covenant. Right? Because that's the final thing at the end of Deuteronomy for covenant fidelity. The failure of the covenant is the dissolution of the nation. And God is never willing to destroy his people. And so instead, God comes as God's own people, and God destroys God's self in their place. Right?
So when God says, "Behold my beloved son in whom I am well pleased,"
yes,
that's what he's
talking about
actually
his son Israel, whom he is, right? Whom he embodies. And he's also talking about Jesus, the Son, the second person of the Trinity. And so God kills God's self. God sacrifices God's self. And in so doing completes the sort of requirements of the Deuteronomic covenant and releases the people from it in a certain sense. But the other thing that Jesus does is, Jesus is also Messiah. Mashiach is a word in Hebrew that means anointed one. And you anoint two kinds of people in ancient Israel. And I'll give you exactly two guesses what kinds of people you anoint in ancient. Who do we anoint in the stories in the Old Testament? Priests and kings. We anoint the Levitical priest, the high priest. We anoint the Davidic king. Jesus is anointed as the true high priest. That's how Hebrews thinks about him. As the Davidic king. That's how Paul and Matthew think about him. The Son of Man, right? The man of the line of David. And in so doing, he combines these two roles in his messiahship. And this is what enables him to be the perfect articulation of Israel. And this is what enables him, through the cross, to release his people from exile. In fact, to release all people from exile, right? Like a true and perfect release from exile, and a true and perfect entrance into covenant relationship with God. So if we're thinking about the relationship between, you mentioned before, like the typological relationship between David and Christ, this is a way to think about that typological relationship. That yes, Jesus is David.
So when Jesus says, "A new covenant in my blood," this is what he means. This is what he means.
Yeah, this is what he means. You can even like if we build this out to talk about Abraham, I would say that it is. This is Galatians really. Paul thinks that it's the opening of the Abrahamic covenant, because the Abrahamic covenant is universal in scope. Right? By means of you, all people on earth will be blessed. and Jesus is the one who fully and completely enacts, opens up, makes possible the full reach of the Abrahamic covenant. And that's why when Paul's talking about that, he'll eventually get to, therefore there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. We are all one in Christ Jesus, because there's no, like, these defining lines have been removed by the work of Christ. So we think about Deuteronomy, about the Deuteronomistic history. It's this part of the story, but you got to have this part of the story to get that part of the story, right? And in many ways, this part of the story is the most instructive thing to understand why this part of the story matters, right? If we don't get the story about the constant and never-ending attempts to live out this relationship and failing at it over and over again, then Jesus doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's one of, there's a whole bunch of ways into Jesus by means of the stories that we're going to tell. But certainly that's like the destination we want to be getting ourselves to, right? Because we don't just want to be like David or be like Solomon, because we don't necessarily actually want that. But it's more like we want to say, understand David and Solomon, understand their story, understand the place their story has in our story, and consequently understand what it means to be the people of God, kind of here and now, as like a part of that ongoing story. Right? We're getting a chapter of it, which helps us sort of identify ourselves, I think. So, that's kind of what I have for you tonight.
This is fabulous, but you've left me behind.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So
help me catch
why
it.
did he have to die? Like, what did the death...
What does the death of Jesus do? Okay, so if you think about it in Jewish terms, especially first century Jewish terms, the Jews considered themselves bound by the covenant with God.
Okay.
And the negative consequences, the final terminal negative consequences of that covenant, if you violate the covenant, is the destruction of Israel.
Okay, yeah.
And so there needs to be some kind of solution to that problem. And it seems like Paul, especially, to a significant degree Matthew, some of the New Testament authors, what they see here is the problem is God needs to find a way to set aside the Deuteronomic covenant. But God can't break it.
Okay.
It's God's covenant, right? And so and God doesn't want to destroy the people because they're his people. He loves them. So what does God do? God comes, right? God in the flesh comes and becomes Israel. And this is like, all four of the Gospel tell us slightly different version of the Jesus story. Very similar, but they have their own kind of like emphases. And Matthew especially is really on about this.
Well, it's Matthew that says, "In whom I am well pleased."
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And like it's Matthew also. Like Matthew goes to great pains at the beginning of the Gospel to really emphasize Jesus' Jewishness, the genealogy of Jesus and how Jewish he is. He goes through the River Jordan and then out into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights, which is like a typological symbol of the people of Israel going through the Red Sea and then wandering the desert for 40 years. So Jesus really is Israel. And so because Jesus is Israel, when Jesus dies, in a meaningful sense, Israel, as violators of the covenant, die in Jesus. Right? And consequently, we can bring the problem to a conclusion.
And then the new covenant replaces.
Yeah.
Which I've always, as a worship leader, I think especially, I've always seen that as this extraordinary story of God's faithfulness.
Yes.
He promised these things to these people.
Yes.
And he delivered through Christ.
Yeah.
And his justice. He couldn't just wipe everyone out and still be a good God.
Yeah.
And so he took it upon himself in order to provide justice. Like there's such moving accounts of what he has delivered for us, and it comes back to something that I'm sure you agree with, and that is that God is really the hero in these stories.
Yeah.
This is his story. It's history.
Yeah.
And in that, it's a story of his greatness and faithfulness and
his
justice.
His incredible patience.
Yeah. It makes me think of
to literally allow that to play out over centuries.
Yeah.
And still stick to the original plan.
And manage
not
these kind of
I'm going to change the rules. We're going to do a covenant 2.0. This isn't working.
Well, but I would even say, and most theologians would say, the covenant with the covenant of grace through Christ is not like a plan B. it is the plan. It's the only way for the plan to work, right? Because the original, like the covenant with Moses, is a way into the covenant with Jesus.
The book of Romans, case in point, I mean, basically that's what Paul describes through there, is that, this didn't work, that didn't work, this didn't work,
But laying out the direction towards Christ, which is an inevitability, I think, in Christian theology, the notion that Jesus is utterly inevitable and must be, right? Because it is the only way to bring about a necessary relationship. But you're not wrong, Terry. Like it reminds me of that song, whatever it's called that we sing, the overwhelming, never-ending, restless love of God. This notion of God in relationship with this recalcitrant people. This stubborn, frustrating, and just human, really human people. And God being, I find this very encouraging, God being therefore in relationship with me. And my own frustrations and stubbornness and missing the mark and trying and not understanding and all that. So, I find actually the Deuteronomic history kind of encouraging, even though it's a little depressing in some ways too. But it's like, no, God is, every time it falls down, God's like, okay, up we get. Let's go. We're gonna do it again, y'all. And they keep falling down over and over again. And then eventually God's like, okay, so I'm gonna do it this time.
Hold my beer.
Yeah. It really is. It really is exactly.
Sorry.
I'll just do it my damn self. Sometimes how I say it. Yeah, especially when you get to the prophets, where God is really, and you're like Ezekiel and Jeremiah. God's like, okay, so when we do this again, because you are not clearly capable. Anyway, did that help to clarify a little bit?
No, that's great.
Okay.
That's tremendously exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, cool.
Well, for me too, Jesus' death on the cross, in order to fulfill an ancient covenant, replace it with a new one, to deal with the people of Israel. Oh, and by the way, we're included too.
Yeah.
It for me, having lived under gospel preachings for my entire life, that's just opened up a scale of it that I hadn't really seen before. It was like, he died for me because I'm a sinner, and he died for my sins. But you tended to keep it a personalized transaction, and didn't realize that something much bigger was playing out.
Yeah.
We were probably told, I just didn't listen because I found the Old Testament really boring and complicated.
Well, and it's easy for us, especially as evangelicals, to pay very close attention to the personal salvation of individual people. And it's important to say that God simultaneously saves the individual, but really, God saves the body of Christ, of which we as individuals are a part.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and God loves us individually, of course, but God saves the body of Christ, and we get dragged along with Jesus, is probably the best way of thinking about it. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully this helps a little bit of some context. You're going to take your passages the direction you take them, and that's cool. And I'm also like, if you're in the middle of it and you're like, oh, I can't remember what we talked about, or I have more questions, or this wasn't clear, you drop me an email and I'm happy to chat.
Do you want to say anything about commentaries?
Oh yeah, thanks. I almost forgot. And these aren't actually, none of these are commentaries on our books, but commentaries are good tools. And I don't know how much y'all have worked with them or not. But there's like a kind of a specific kind of tool. So if somebody hasn't worked with them, they can be a little something. Yeah, they can be a little daunting to start with, but they're not that tricky. They pretty much all are structured in the same way. They're going to be structured with an introduction, and the introduction is going to talk a lot about date, structure of the book as a whole, and that I recommend everybody always try to read the introduction first, because it'll be like, I only want to talk about this one passage. Sure, this will help you to locate that passage in the book, and context and all that kind of stuff. So that's a good place to start, but then after that, you actually can just skip to your passage, because they're reference books, right? So if you flip them open, usually they're going to have instead of page numbers, they're going to have passage numbers. And you can just flip to, this is Proverbs 11:19 is here. And depending on the type of commentary, they're probably going to have several things. They're going to have probably an original translation of your passage by the author of the commentary. So you're going to get kind of an interesting translation from an expert, which might going to be a little bit different from your translation for various reasons. So you should compare and contrast. And then you're going to have probably a short introduction to that subsection. This is what I think this passage is about. And then they're going to walk you through verse by verse. And so that's especially helpful for if you read something, you're like, what is happening here? Like a student emailed me the other day with like, what is happening in this passage of Revelation? And like that was very much like a commentary question of like, why are the outer courts mentioned here? And that's the kind of stuff that commentaries will usually go into detail on, like weird tidbits that helpful interpretation.
I have a bit of a pathetic commentary library.
Oh, yours is okay. After building it, yeah.
Well, but in this portion,
for Kings,
lots of New Testament stuff,
yeah,
and then portions of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But then a few years ago, I started buying Kindle versions.
Oh yeah, sure.
So half of my library now is on my computer.
Yeah.
So it means that it's going to be more difficult for me to share resources with others. So I wonder, maybe you could email me or us, so maybe some preferred commentaries.
Yeah, I was just going to ask.
What I'll say, I'll just show you something here.
Because based on what we said earlier, that certain people contain history based on how do we make sure we're not reading the wrong commentary.
Yeah, for sure. And do you know what? I swear to you, there's a website called bestcommentaries.com.
Yeah.
And this is it. So if you just go to bestcommentaries.com, it's not a perfect website, but it's actually pretty helpful. And then it breaks down by book at the top here, so you can like hover over Old Testament and then you go to the book that you want. So I think I'm in Samuel here, am I? Yeah, this is Samuel commentaries. So they've highlighted some, and they even also give you like, here, just let me maximize this window so you can read a little better. They give you, this is the actual list. So they've given it to you in sort of like a ranked order. And I don't always agree with the rankings, but for our purposes, they're fine, right? They're generally fine. Now, some little tidbits here that will help you. They've tagged them based on the type of commentary, and they use especially three: pastoral, devotional, and technical. So a pastoral commentary is something that's written for somebody with some theological education, but it's pretty accessible and usually has like theology, practical application, that kind of stuff. Devotional is usually written for a lay audience, so anybody should be able to read it and get some good value out of it. Technical is written for me, like for a scholar, somebody. Usually the real distinction is somebody who has access to the original languages. So I would say I know you guys, I know all of our preachers pretty well. Any pastoral commentary will be fine for you. You'll be fine. Devotional commentaries are okay. They tend to be a little light on exegetical meat sometimes, and so they're fine. Technical commentaries you may or may not struggle with. It'll depend on the specific one. So for example, the Anchor Yale Bible the Anchor Yale Bible series commentary by McCarter, I probably wouldn't recommend that, even to an intermediate person like that. It's going to assume substantial knowledge of the original languages.
And part of the problem is you just get dragged down. Like it's so
densely
detailed, dense that you can't really get to what you really need as a preacher.
And as you can see, there is 2 volumes, and each of which is about 500 pages. Like they're monsters. And so I would say, if you can find good pastoral commentaries, the series that you're going to find really helpful, actually, this series, which is the NIV application commentary series, this is a real good one. Who's the NIV one? Oh, it's Bill Arnold. Yeah, so Bill Arnold's NIV commentary would be quite a good one for Samuel. What else we got here? Yeah, Joyce Baldwin's will be good and quite accessible. It's sort of in between pastoral and devotional. They'll have some good theology stuff in it. What else we have here? If you want a technical one, Ralph Klein's Word Biblical Commentary one is probably the closest.
Relative?
No. I know, right? That's a very Alberta joke. Nobody else thinks that. But Klein's it's not, I would never call it readable, but it is, it will give you useful information if you're willing to wade through it. Gene Peterson's got a commentary on Samuel, which would be good for you. And then I would say the other one that would be kind of interesting would be Robert Alter's David story. So Robert Alter is one of my very favorite Jewish biblical scholars, and he is a great translator, and he's got a real feel for narrative, especially. Now, if you can't find these, like Terry probably doesn't have, I don't have actually any of these, but Ambrose has all of them.
I think I have Bill Arnold.
Oh, do you have Arnold's?
On Kindle.
Oh, sure. And that's a really good resource.
Well, I might even have the Walter Brueggemann.
Brueggemann's. Oh, yeah. I actually really like that one.
Yeah, he calls that devotional.
Yeah. Well, they usually call the IBC, the interpretation series, they often call them. This, again, there's a theological bias on this website. They're pretty reformed, and they're not a big fan of the IBC commentaries. No. But I think some of them are very good, especially Brueggemann's. And Walter Brueggemann is another guy that has a real feel for story. He really gets the flow of stories and characterization and how dramatic things are moving, so he'd be really good on that front too. But yeah, if you need access, you can always go to Ambrose and use the library, right? It's accessible to anybody, and the librarians will help you find stuff, and we have basically everything under God's Earth for commentaries. And if you need to get something from there, as long as you give me some lead time, I can probably get it for you. It just means I gotta make a trip in, that's all. But I can borrow stuff for big chunks of time, and I'm happy to borrow on other people's behalf.
Yeah.
You can also get a card for yourself if you want to.
And I will have a budget to help out at least
Sure.
with, if you just say, like, I think I should try to have this for my own library.
Yeah.
We can help make that happen.
Yeah, and I might buy one or two just for myself too, because I've got my own personal budget for this through work, and I'm happy to loan whatever I get to. So, but we can like what I would say is we should maybe conspire a little bit together, and what would be like an effective use of resources to get a couple of things that we can all access, but then also Ambrose is by far the best place, like the best theological library in Western Canada. So we've got the stuff that you need, And also the other thing that I can do for people is I can look up articles, which I can just dig up as PDFs usually and just email them to you if you want that too. So just ask if you're looking for stuff.
I want to just jump into my passage quickly. So I'm starting it off with Saul to be king, and does God want a king or not?
Sure.
So what was coming to me at that time, because I've spent a fair bit of time studying about the kingdom of God.
Yeah,
What
sure.
does Jesus talk about as he talks about the kingdom of God? So do you see any relation between what we're talking about with not wanting it, God saying, I want to be your king, and the kingdom of God? Are you?
Yeah, yes and no. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, I would say at one level, the two kingdoms we're talking about are very distinct, right? Because Saul's kingdom is, of course, like a temporal, political institution. And the kingdom of God, as the New Testament talks about it, the Basileia tou Theou, is not it is in a certain sense the political order, but it's like it's not. Even Jesus says it's not of this world, right? It is like it's a heavenly kingdom. It's more like a different way of living in the world. So in that sense, they're quite different. But one of the things you are catching that's quite important here is the centrality of the kingship of God in both cases. So ancient Israel was supposed to be a nation focused on God as king. Even with David even with the Davidic king is supposed to be like a proxy for God, almost like a steward of God's kingship, which doesn't work out in the end, but that's what it's supposed to be like. Yeah. And when Jesus comes, when he establishes the kingdom of heaven, and when our citizenship is now in heaven, he is our king. Right? And in that sense, yes, God is our king. But think about just like that interesting irony that Jesus is our king, which means God is our king. But Jesus is our king, which means the Son of David is our king. But we have a king who is both God and human. And so like the answer to your question is kind of like simultaneously yes and no in sort of interesting ways. In some ways, the kingdom of heaven is nothing like ancient Israel. But in some ways, it's very much like ancient Israel. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll explore that some more and probably come back to you with some more questions.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And there's I think that thinking about the kingship of God is a very interesting thing to think about. The sovereignty of God and what a king is for, and those things. Those are interesting things to think about. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So, Jesus being called Son of David, does that link back to the house will endure forever?
Yeah.
Is that the fulfillment of
that's how the New Testament authors read it, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and they read their Psalms that they pick up on, and
yeah,
all sorts of Davidic stuff. Yeah, this hope for David.
It's incredible when you talk about, the covenant and the specification of what a king should be and how it took Jesus to ultimately fulfill it. It also just shed a very ironic light on we will not have this man reign over us.
Yes. Yeah.
It's that it takes that awful statement and actually gives it an incredible irony. The only one who had ever stood on this earth that fulfilled utterly in every sense
Oh, but then you gotta take that irony that there's another irony, like that's the ironic twist, and then take the irony the next step with Matthew and the other gospel writers, which is what does Pilate put on his cross when he lifts him up over top? He puts on his cross, Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews. And they're like, say he claimed to be the King of the Jews, and Pilate's like, I wrote what I wrote. Yeah. And this is what it says. And for Matthew, the crucifixion is the moment of Jesus' enthronement as king over the kingdom of heaven. Like that's the moment that Jesus is the most king that Jesus will ever be, is when he is enthroned on the cross. And this is even in Revelation why we call him, and I looked to the Lion of Judah and I saw a lamb who was slain, right? We sometimes get that wrong, we're like he's a lion and a lamb. No. We look to the lion and we see who he really is, which is he's the Lion of Judah, who is the lamb who was slain, right? So you're like right, that insight is exactly correct, Bill. And the irony is like, there's an ironic twist and then an ironic twist on top of the ironic twist. That whole section is just like Matthew just digging the knife in over and over and over again on those ironies.
Well, a pretty compelling picture in Revelation then when he comes riding on the white stallion, with the sword in his hand. Yeah. He's the conquering king, which is exactly that image of the ideal king from the Old Testament, but he comes with righteousness. And
he draws the sword from his mouth.
Right.
Because the sword is not a sword, the sword is his word. Yeah. Right? So again, Revelation is like, look we know what you think you want. You think you want a great conquering hero. You don't want that.
Bit of a warning against unnecessarily vilifying the Roman Empire and other empires that will come.
Their empires.
It's not vilifying.
Lauding and desiring. This goes to your question, Tricia. The constant human habit of desiring the triumph of the kingdom now. I want our people to be the bosses of everything, which is again not at all what the kingdom of heaven is like. Right? The kingdom of heaven is ruled over by Christ, who is God. Yeah. Super.
Why don't you pray for us, Colin?
I will. Yeah. So we should wrap up. God of grace, we're grateful again. Grateful for the time you give us, grateful for good conversation, grateful for these faithful people who desire to make the word known, to open up to your congregation. And we just want to pray now for your people as we anticipate all these various sermons over the course of the summer. We want to pray for your people that their hearts will be open. Spirit, we ask that you'll go before us and that you'll be with us in our times of preparation, our times of reflection and thinking, and that you'll be with us even as we preach, and that you will be with your people, and that whatever human errors we may make, that your people will receive from you that which they need, and that you will enable us in our small and humble ways to help to feed your sheep, and that we will ourselves be fed by you and fed by one another. And so we just want to be humble, faithful servants in the midst of this work this summer, and we're grateful you give us the chance to do it. Pray all these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thanks for hanging out so late.
Thank you for being with us.
That was great. Thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure.